Шановні колеги, ми продовжуємо нашу роботу, і я хочу запросити зараз до доповіді нашого великого друга, людину, яка нас дуже підтримувала, ну і під час ковіду, да, і особливо під час війни. Це психодраматист, груповий терапевт з аналітичної юнгіанської психодрами, ліцензований, сертифікований травмаорієнтований психотерапевт, ліцензований психотерапевт в парі сім'ї, арт-терапевт, засновник, педагог, голова Інституту юнгіанської психодрами, соціодрами та громадського психічного здоров'я доктора Алі Бабаогли, лауреат премії Зерки Марино та премії Барбари Честер Лікарі за права людини. І він виступить з пленарною доповіддю «Колективне, горе». Прошу, шановний Джанер, вам дається 45 хвилин для доповіді, для своєї доповіді. Слухаємо вас.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you our knowledge. There will be a spontaneous translation, right? Okay. So, when a massive disaster occurs or traumatic event occurs, those who are affected may experience psychological impact in several ways. First, many individuals will suffer from various forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Second, new social processes and shared behaviors may appear throughout the affected communities, initiated by changes in the shared psychological states of the affected persons. And third, traumatized persons may mostly unconsciously oblige their progeny to resolve the directly traumatized generations' own unfinished psychological tasks related to the shared trauma, such as mourning various losses. You know, there are lots of types of disasters, floods, volcanic eruptions, human-made or the nature-made, and the war is one of the terrible of the traumatic events we are face to face. Today we are going to talk about collective grief. It is very parallel to the grief, but it is another issue. On rethinking vulnerability, violence, and resistance, we do not have to love one another to engage in meaningful solidarity. One way of posing the question of who we are in these times of war is by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. We might think of war as dividing populations into those who are grievable and those who are not. An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived. That is, it has never counted as a life at all. We can see the division of the globe into grievable and ungrievable lives from the perspective of those who wage war in order to defend the lives of certain communities and to defend them against the lives of others, even if it means taking those latter lives. About subjects and social groups whose deaths cannot be publicly mourned, repeating Antigone, can these acts of mourning be transformed into forms of dissidence when these deaths are publicly mourned? We can think about the public mourning of the disappeared in Chile and Argentina, the major AIDS demonstrations that involved highly theatrical efforts to mark and grieve those lives that were considered ungrievable. We ignored all those communities, all those societies who are in this kind of disasters. The current wars depend not only on the unpresentability of the war death, but also on systematic effort to produce certain populations as ungrievable. as you all are experiencing nowadays in Ukraine, it creates a big topic that all the community must be aware of, that no one can be forgotten to grieve, to have the grief, to honor it by the grief. If we do not grieve, it means we do not count the life that was lived. So this is important. The current wars depend on not only on the unrepresentability of the war death, but also on a systematic effort to produce certain populations as ungrievable. It was interesting that Antigone was forbidden to mourn publicly her brother. Creon was trying not only to control the public show of her fidelity, but to decide who counts as kin. As a result, the way she lays claim to that bond seeks to contest the sovereign control over what counts as kinship and what does not. More generally, we can see the importance of public grieving when those who are grieved are supposed to be ungrievable lives. A life that is not supposed to be grieved is also a life that is not supposed to have existed at all, whose negation is built into its very public definition. I think that war would be less easy to wage if certain populations were regarded as part of the existing, that is, those whose lives are legitimate. Speaking from the rage does not always let us see how rage carries sorrow and covers it over. How often is sorrow effectively shouted down by rage? How does it happen that sorrow can bring about the collapse of rage? Is there something to be learned about the sources of nonviolence from this particular power of grief to deflate rage of its destructiveness? And Kersten asks, why does tragedy exist? And then answers, because you are full of rage. Why are you full of rage? Because you are full of grief. Ask a headhunter why he cuts off human heads. He will say that rage impels him and rage is born of grief. The act of severing and losing away the victim's head enables him to throw away all of his bereavements. You may think this does not apply to you, yet you recall the day your wife, driving you to your mother's funeral, turned left instead of right at the intersection, and you had to scream at her so loud other drivers turned to look when you tore her head off and threw it out the window. They nodded, changed gears, drove away, and called. The grief is unbearable, and from that unbearability, one kills. A killing that produces more grief. Have we yet figured out exactly how this works? The transition from unbearable grief to uncontrollable rage and destructiveness. Perhaps grief is imagined to end with violence, as if grief itself could be killed. Can we perhaps find one of the sources of non-violence in the capacity to grieve, to stay with the unbearable loss without converting it into destruction? If we could bear our grief, would we be less inclined to strike back or strike out? And if the grief is unbearable, is there another way to live with it that is not the same as bearing it? We know the contours of this terrible circle, destroying to stop the unbearable grief, to bring an end to the unbearable, only to then redouble that loss by destroying again. Perhaps that destructive act is a way of announcing that what is unbearable is now someone else's problem, not mine. Here, you take this unbearable thing, now it belongs to you. A loss might seem utterly personal, private, isolating, but it also may furnish an unexpected concept of political community, even a premonition of a source of nonviolence. If the life that is mine is not originally or finally separable from yours, then the we who we are is not just a composite of you and me and all the others, but a set of relations of interdependency and passion. And these we cannot deny or destroy without refuting something fundamental about the social conditions of our living. What follows is an ethical injunction to preserve those bonds, even the wretched ones, which means precisely guarding against those forms of destructiveness that take away our lives and those of others beings and the ecological conditions of life. In other words, before ever losing, we are lost in the other, lost without the other, but we never knew it as well as we do when we do actually lose. This being integral is one way of describing the social relations that have the power to sustain and to break us way before we enter into contracts that confirm that our relations are, we are already in the hands of the others. A thrilling and terrifying way to begin. We are from the start both done and undone by the other. And if we refuse this, we refuse passion, life, and loss. I mean, according to this knowledge, when we look at our community life in Ukraine during the time of difficulty and invasion and destruction and collective violence by Russians, and it means we have to take care of each other, we have to count each other, we have to take the responsibility of the other in the community about whose lives are lost. The lived form of that refusal is distraction. The lived form of its affirmation is nonviolence. Perhaps nonviolence is the difficult practice of letting rage collapse into grief, since then we stand the chance of knowing we are bound up with others such that who I am or who you are is this living relation that we sometimes lose. With great speed, we do sometimes drive away from the unbearable or drive precisely into its clutches, or do both at once, not knowing how we move or with what consequence. It seems unbearable to be patient with unbearable loss, and yet that slowness, that impediment can be the condition for showing what we value and even perhaps what steps to take to preserve what it is left of what we love. It seems, however, that there are also paradigmatic victims whose lives are mourned daily in the context of humanitarian policies, missions, and projects. They might be anonymous and silent, but at the same time, they tend to be incredibly visible. Can we think of borders, boundaries, violence, and mourning outside the paradigmatic victimization of certain categories? It is important to mark and know victimization, but it would be a mistake if we took victimization as a paradigm for political subjugation. Of course, sometimes no resistance is possible under situations of extreme coercion, but sometimes coercion is itself subverted through various acts of disobedience, through modes of unexpected solidarity and collective action. It is not enough to have politics that has public mourning as its final goal. The point of public mourning is to expand our ideas of what constitutes a livable life, to expand our recognition of those lives that are worth protecting, worth valuing. This is importantly not an individual activity, but something that not only happens in public, but has the power to redefine the public sphere. I think we have to develop a notion of critical recognition, which would be the practice of seeking recognition in terms of existing norms, extending norms of equality and justice, for instance, but also interrogating and challenging the reach and character of those norms. If we only seek recognition, we will be bound to existing norms. But if we care about those who can never receive recognition from existing norms, then we have to bring about new social forms, even new forms. This means interrogating the limits of the recognizable and formulating a political precisely there. I mean, this issue is important, especially after the massacres, genocide activities done by colonialist Russia, or done by collective aggression of the Russians. And we have to count, we have to create new social norms to continue as a human action. We have to create public mourning and some rituals and some recognitions and among the community to handle to handle the horror, to handle the aggression, to handle the hate, rage. We have to create our public norms, and we have to continue to our community life with our public mourning and rituals in order to make them to be recognized for these rituals, for this public mourning. We have to honor them, we have to recognize them, we have to define the lives of them in order to create new bounds, to create new norms, to create new boundaries among our communities for the future life, where the enemy or where the other aggressor is distracting. Precariousness and grievability is also important. We read about lives lost and are often given the numbers, but these stories are repeated every day, and the repetition appears endless, irremediable. And so we have to ask, what will it take not only to apprehend the precarious characters of lives lost in war, but to have that apprehension coincide with an ethical and political opposition to the losses war entails. Among the questions that follow from this situation are, how is effect produced by the structure of the frame? And what is the relation of effect to the ethical and political judgment and practice? To say that a life is precarious requires not only that a life be apprehended as a life, but also that precariousness be an aspect of what is apprehended in what is living, normatively construed. I am arguing that there ought to be a more inclusive and egalitarian way of recognizing precariousness, and that is should take form as concrete social policy regarding such issues as shelter, work, food, medical care, and legal status, and other issues. And yet, I am also insisting in a way that might seem initially paradoxical, that precariousness itself cannot be properly recognized. It can be apprehended, taken in, encountered, and it can be presupposed by certain norms of recognition, just as it can be refused by such norms. And indeed, there ought to be recognition of precariousness as a shared condition of human life, indeed as a condition that links human and non-human animals, but we ought not to think that the recognition of precariousness masters or captures or even fully cognize what it recognizes. So although I would argue that norms of recognition ought to be based on an apprehension of precariousness, I do not think that precariousness is a function or effect of recognition, nor that recognition is the only or the best way to register precariousness. To say that a life is injurable, for instance, or that it can be lost, destroyed, or systematically neglected to the point of death, is to underscore not only the finitude of a life, that death is certain, but also its precariousness, that life requires various social and economical conditions to be met in order to be sustained as a life. Precariousness implies living socially. That is the fact that one's life is always in some sense in the hands of the other. Why I bring this issue today? Because the experience of the Middle East massacres, Middle East genocides, Middle East war, nowadays also in the North Africa in the past, nowadays brings the this issue, precariousness, ignored community as an invisible or hidden reality, or hidden or neglected or denied reality, happens in Ukraine nowadays. I mean, Ukraine community, Ukraine people are alone in their fight with these realities, and trying to create and trying to register, recognize the losses they have experienced by themselves, but it needs a big teamwork, big.
Подвійний переклад, колеги-перекладачі. Ви обидві почали перекладати.
Excuse me? Hello? Yeah, I cannot hear.
Все в нас нормально?
Any problem?
Джанер, чи чує?
Any problem? I will continue.
Джанер, продовжуйте. Так?
Continue.
Джанер, можна продовжувати? Просіло щось. Написали. Так, чому в нас...
Джанер, you can continue. You don't hear the translator. She's speaking with you, so you can continue.
I know. Somebody said something, and then I wait for the, yeah. I tried to understand.
No, yes, you can
Okay.
continue. It's okay.
Okay. Yes, with the reality and experience in the Middle East because of the war and collective traumas, and then this collective grief issue is very important to survive and to create a livable community for the future. And if a life is not counted or recognized when people are dying during the during the resistance and defending the democracy in the region of Middle East against ISIS terrorism, for example, no one knows. Nearly 26,000 people died, and no one knows who are they. What did they do? In the name of democracy, in the name of protection of the communities, kids, minorities, women, 26,000 people has been killed and died, and no one knows. In Iraq, during the Saddam terrorism against minorities, against groups, opposition groups in 90s and in 80s and 90s, there were nearly 300,000 people died, and no one knows. And during the Iraq war, nearly 1.5–2 million people has lost their lives, and no one knows. No one knows. So what I am trying to bring as an issue to this topic, as a collective grief, we have to create a structure for the lives at witness, and we had experience in our communities in Ukraine about precariousness, and because the life is ignored by others, so we need to recognize their lives. Okay, so this is important, but I'm trying to bring this issue as a collective grief. Precariousness implies living socially. That is the fact that one's life is always, in some sense, in the hands of the other. It implies exposure both to those we know and to those we do not know. A dependency on people we know or barely know, or know not at all. Reciprocally, it implies being impinged upon by the exposure and dependency of others, most of whom remain anonymous. We don't know their names, any names. I mean, they are anonymous. These are not necessarily relations of love or even of care, but constitute obligations towards others, most of whom we cannot name and we don't know, and who may or may not bear the traits of familiarity to an established sense of who we are. In the interest of speaking in common parlance, we could say that we have such obligations to others and presume that we know who we are in such an instance. The social implication of this view, however, is precisely that the we does not and cannot recognize itself, that it is riven from that start, interrupted by alterity, as Levinas has said, and the obligations we have are precisely those that disrupt any established notion of the we. We remember the story of the Cain and Abel in the Bible, and when the God asks, where is your brother? Cain replied, I am not guardian of my brother. And this is the border of our human responsibility for the other. And then this is the message for our human life, that we have responsibility for our neighbor, for our other. Over and against an existential concept of finitude that singularizes our relation to death and to life, precariousness underscores our radical substitutability and anonymity in relation both to certain socially facilitated modes of dying and death, and to other socially conditioned modes of persisting and flourishing. It is not that we are born and then later become precarious, but rather that precariousness is coextensive with birth itself, which means that it matters whether or not this infant being survives, and that his survival is dependent on what we might call a social network of ends. Precisely because of a living being may die, it is necessary to care for that being so that it may live. Only under conditions in which the loss would matter does the value of the life appear. Thus, grievability is a presupposition for the life that matters. For the most part, we imagine that an infant comes into the world, is sustained and in and by that world through the adulthood and old age, and finally dies. We imagine that when the child is wanted, there is celebration at the beginning of life, but there can be no celebration without an implicit understanding that the life is grievable, that it would be grieved if it were lost, and that this future anterior is installed as the condition of its life. In ordinary language, grief attends the life that has already been lived and presupposes that life as having ended. But according to the future anterior, grievability is a condition of a life's emergence and sustenance. The future anterior, a life has been lived, is presupposed at the beginning of a life that, in other words, this will be a life that will have been lived, is the presupposition of a grievable life, which means that this will be a life that can be regarded as a life. So here is the importance of the topic that brings us thinking about from the beginning of the war in Ukraine, many people has lost their lives. Many of them, some of them were very important operator, surgeon, neurosurgeon, or some of them were artists, some of them were important lives, but now they are not living, and we need to bring the with honoring the grief, not only one by one, but also in community way. Grievability precedes and makes possible the apprehension of the living being as living exposed to non-life from the start. One way of posing the question of by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. we might think of war as dividing populations into those who are grievable and those who are not. We can look at the 9/11, for example, after the attacks of 9/11 in the United States. It's encountered in the media graphic pictures of those who died along with their names, their stories, the reaction of their families. Public grieving was dedicated to making these images iconic for the nation, which meant, of course, that there was considerably less public grieving for non-US nationals and none of all for illegal workers. The differential distribution of public grieving, I mean, also when we think about central countries and peripheral countries, according to the economy or the power, we can talk about the precarious life and non-grievable or ungrievable lives of the peripheral countries, like the Middle East, like the border countries, or I mean, the countries who are not in the visibility of the human community and family. So differential distribution of public grieving is a political issue of enormous significance. It has been since at least the time of Antigone, when she chose openly to mourn the death of one of her brothers, even though it went against the sovereignty law to do so. So open grieving is bound up with outrage, and outrage in the face of injustice or indeed of unbearable loss has enormous political potential. When we decide to create a collective grief and mourning and bereavement, it is a very political potential activity to handle and to bear the pain and sorrow of the lost among the community, in the community, to create the justice again in the community back. It is, after all, one of the reasons Plato wanted to ban the poets from the Republic. He thought that if the citizens went too often to watch tragedy, they would weep over the losses they saw, and that such open and public mourning in disrupting the order and hierarchy of the soul would disrupt the order and hierarchy of the political authority as well. So, as you see how an important activity and political activity also strengthening the community in the time of war that invaded by enemy. We have to create these activities, and we have to remember that it is a struggle, it is a strengthening the community. Whether we are speaking about open grief or outrage, we are talking about effective responses that are highly regulated by regimes of power and sometimes subject to explicit censorship. This is also a war against the enemy in a non-violent way, to bring this memory, to bring this collective memory, to bring this honorization, to bring this lives, to give them that grievable and honored life. The question, though, of whose lives are to be regarded as grievable, as worthy of protection, as belonging to subjects with rights that ought to be honored, returns us to the question of how affect is regulated and of what we mean by the regulation of affect at all. And we can see anthropologist Talal Assad recently wrote a book about suicide bombing, in which the first question he possesses is, why do we feel horror and moral repulsion in the face of suicide bombing when we do not always feel the same way in the face of the state-sponsored violence? I mean, everybody is talking about suicide bombing people, but no one is talking about collective aggressor, collective violence and invaders. This is also a paradox. There will be long, I will not talk about more. I will come to, yes, collective grief. occurs when a community, society, town, city, nation, or the whole world collectively experience extreme change or loss. Grief is a normal response to anger, loss, and violence. When the trauma affects an entire community, it is known as communal or collective grief. And collective grief occurs when a community, society, town, city, nation, or the whole world collectively experience extreme change or loss. Grief is a normal response to anger, loss, and violence. When the trauma affects an entire community, it is known as communal or collective grief. And it also brings the other issue of collective memory. So if there is there any difference between collective grief and communal grief? Yeah, communal grief refers to the experience of belonging to and sharing with a group of people that are also grieving. Refers to the experience of belonging to and sharing with a group of people that are also grieving. Collective grief encompasses a community. Community grief refers to the community grieving together. Community grief, communal grief, and collective grief are essentially interchangeable. Communal grief has been practiced for centuries. It is not a new concept, but we are recognizing more communal grief today, nowadays, due to the worldwide effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, as you all remember. What causes collective grief? This type of grief happens in the aftermath of powerful events like war, natural disasters, or something that can result in widespread tragedy. I think school shootings are also among the worst, like the war and disasters. The most lasting and haunting grief is the loss of a child. As parents, we send our children to school, which is and should be a safe place. But in a tragedy such as this, they do not come home. Nothing could be worse. Yeah, this is another collective grief. What are some ways that communities can mourn? I mean, public funerals and memorials, town hall meetings and public forums, protests and rallies, parades and processionals, a moment of silence or prayer, 2 minutes silence on Remembrance Day, something like this, social media posts and groups, grief therapy offered by the city, counseling centers, churches and other groups also, donations to help those who most affected due to these losses and grieving process, and volunteer days for rebuilding, cleanup, etc. These are important. You can increase these possibilities in your culture according to the tradition, according to the cultural opportunities. It is a transcultural task also. When grief encompasses a community, we should encourage everyone to gather together. People gathering in one place will help them to grieve with one another, share their heartaches, hopes, and fears. Community-wide tragedies will usually require additional grief support for weeks, months, or even years after the events. Communities can mourn together on social media, posting on Facebook and other platforms. I mean, to create, now there is an opportunity to use this social media and posting to make the grievable and to bear the witness on these platforms, to make their lives visible, to create a collective grief together. Communities can mourn together, and you can donate. You can donate to a GoFundMe account to come to the aid of families in need. You can create structures, associations. You can create many infrastructures to support these families, to support these communities. When tragedy strikes, there are plenty of families that need assistance. Take someone under your wing. For example, you can create such a community activities also for the collective recovery, for the collective healing, together with collective grief. And history books will remember 2002.
Дякую, Джанер.
Okay.
У нас
May I-
залишилося буквально 2 хвилинки. Можливо, є в когось питання. Ну, Джанер, в мене є питання. А як, ну, от на вашу точку зору, горювати відносно тих, хто пропав безвісті?
I need translation. I don't understand. Can someone translate? I don't understand. I'm sorry.
Перекладіть, будь ласка.
Якщо нема перекладу, можу допомогти. How to, hello, Janir. The question is, how is to grieve for those who miss in action?
How to? I cannot hear.
How to grieve for those who miss in action?
Yeah. I mean, I said there are steps. I mean, grieving personally and grieving as a communal life and community is possible, and we can create. I was trying to talk about this, but the time is over. You know, the funerals, in a way, about these mass tragedies during the war that missed people. We can create. I mean, in my experience, I had a thesis about people who lost their sons in Turkey for disappeared people, for politically disappeared people. And we worked with them in psychodrama to create encounter, to create meeting points, to remember them, to commemorate them every week, to commemorate them in their symbolic graveyards. And then we created also real groups to search, to look for, to find the body of the missed people. And this is another issue, but we can use our all justice mechanism to punish the perpetrator with these documents, with these realities, to create justice companies all around the world to make them visible.
Дякую. Добре, я щиро дякую Джанеру.
Татьяна, могу вопрос задать?
Що? Ще питання
Можу
хочеш, так?
Питання, так.
Да, будь ласка,
питання.
будь ласка, Лена.
Джанер, хочу спитати, як відрізнити здорове горювання від невротичного? Алло, мене чути?
Джанер, включи переклад.
I cannot, I'm trying to...
Janir, maybe you didn't turn on your translation. Please, where is your translation on a planet?
Yes.
Choose English.
Yes, I choose English and then? Okay. Yes, I hear now. Yes, I hear you. Come on. Okay.
Как отличить здоровое горевание від невротичного?
I mean, we are talking about collective grief. When we talk about neurotic grief and then healthy grief, I think it's about what I am trying to talk, a precarious life. Some of the people is not visible in life. Lower classes, AIDS people, some discriminated people, some populations all around the world during their fight or during their lives are not visible. So what can we create a healthy grief for them to make them visible? I mean, it's the only way to make them visible is a healthy grieving. I mean, for the neurotic grieving, I can tell when we lose something, it's about a lost object in a psychoanalytic way. It is possible to redefine it in our sessions with this object we can put into the session. The transient object, I mean, we can work with transient objects in psychodrama. We can work with a transient object of the grief for this person who lost a life. I mean, the meaning of the life about him. We can bring the session about what amputated about the reality in cognition of our mind in our lives about this lost object. Because when we lose someone, we can also amputate the reality of truth about the world, about life, about ideas, about the reality of this person, because we trust him, and then he passed away. So we will have many steps of the grief, and then we can look for the amputated continuity, and we can work with this amputated continuity to create again a new continuity, to create a bridge that this reality amputated because of this loss.
Дякую, дуже дякую. На жаль, наш регламент говорить про те, що ми повинні продовжувати далі. Я щиро дякую Джанеру за його таку актуальну доповідь, тому що вона дійсно досить актуальна на даний момент для нас, для українців. Далі ми продовжуємо працювати. Ага, так, будь ласка.
Yeah, I want to share my emotion. As being a Kurdish, I have experienced in the region of the Kurdish areas in the Middle East. We do not have any agenda, but we work hard in a way to create the losses, to create the memory of the losses during this time of the difficulties, war, oppressions, and others. I mean, this is important to mourn together for the community to recover, to increase the power of the community, to resist and to survive and then to fight. Thank you.
Дякую. Дякую. Добре, ми продовжуємо. Я би хотіла, щоб нас Гея Логан підключилася. Є вона? Вадим, я не бачу весь екран.
Yes,
Тетяна Олександрівна, там Юдіт підіймає руку.
I'm here.
Юдіт ще піднімає руку. Будь ласка, я просто не бачу, бо не було екрану. Будь ласка, Юдіт.
Okay. Hello, Janir. Thank you for this lecture. I find it very, very utterly important to bring up this subject. And as you remember, Maurizio mentioned, and we have been in Kiev after the Maidan revolution 2 months later. And what we did with these 50 people, we created a memorial statue, and we made a collective mourning because the people were frozen and shocked. So after this mourning, with the music, with a very special music for mourning of soldiers, we were making this grieving, and it was so important to get into life again. So that's, I just wanted to share this very important experience. To get into life and not to remain in this frozen position. Grieving is very important. Thank you. We were grieving this, the hundreds in heaven, as you call it, those people who fall in the Maidan Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And thank you, Janer. That was really beautiful. And I was thinking additionally about when people go into exile or in the diaspora, Ukrainian refugees or any refugees, when they leave their homeland and they have to find some way to assimilate in a different culture, there is an ambiguous loss. There is a loss of homeland, and it's hard to grieve a loss of homeland. I remember speaking to my Tibetan translator, working with a Tibetan exiled community. And although he was born in India, he had to renew a visa every year. And he said to me, I can't return to the land where my people are from, but I don't belong to the land I am in. And I think that is another form of grieving when people go into diaspora. And sometimes unacknowledged grief, which then, if we think of Freud, becomes melancholia.
Дякую, Лова. Ну, для мене з цієї доповіді, да, тобто вона досить цінна, але я записала, через горювання ми відзначаємо цінність того, хто помер, або хто віддав життя за країну, за нас. Щиро дякую ще раз, Джанер.